You ever see a fighter jet change course for a passenger plane? The question came over the intercom in a voice that wasn't meant for the cabin, low and uncertain, as if someone up front had just seen something they couldn't explain. Most of the passengers didn't notice, lost in their screens and quiet conversations, but a few heads lifted, eyes drifting toward the oval windows where the late afternoon sky stretched out in endless blue. Seat 16A sat halfway down the cabin, just over the wing, where the hum of the engines was steady and deep, like a distant drum. The old man in that seat didn't react. He hadn't since boarding. He wore a faded brown jacket that looked older than most of the passengers on board, the fabric worn soft at the edges, the cuffs slightly frayed. His hands rested loosely on his lap, fingers still, veins raised like quiet maps beneath thin skin. His eyes were closed, not asleep, just still. Across the aisle, Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole shifted in his seat, adjusting the crease of his uniform out of habit. He had spent the last hour talking with two other airmen about flight systems, about thrust ratios and software updates, about the kind of machines that didn't just fly. They dominated the sky. He glanced over at the old man again. A quick, dismissive look, the kind you give when something doesn't quite belong in your world. Guy hasn't moved since we took off, one of the airmen muttered, leaning slightly forward. Ethan smirked. Probably his first time flying. Or he just doesn't like it. A light chuckle passed between them, quiet enough not to draw attention, but sharp enough to carry meaning. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence. Nothing serious, just a gentle ripple through the cabin. But it was enough to make a few passengers tighten their grips on armrests. The old man didn't move. Not a flinch, not a breath out of place. Ethan noticed that. He didn't say anything, but something about it lingered, like a detail that didn't quite fit the picture. A few rows ahead, Lieutenant Ryan Brooks lowered his tablet slowly. He had been reviewing routine documents. Nothing urgent, just the kind of paperwork that fills the hours between. Real moments. But now his attention had shifted. Not to the turbulence. Not to the quiet chatter. To the old man. It wasn't anything obvious. It was the stillness. The kind of stillness you don't learn, you carry. Brooks watched as the man's right hand lifted slightly, just an inch off his lap, fingers tapping once, twice, then stopping. A pattern. Subtle. Almost invisible. But deliberate. Brooks frowned, leaning back in his seat, his mind pulling at something half-remembered, something buried under years of training and briefings. Across the aisle, Ethan leaned over just enough to speak, his tone casual, edged with that same easy confidence. "Hey, sir," he said, not waiting for a response before continuing. "You ever serve?" The old man opened his eyes. Slow, clear, blue like winter sky. He turned his head just enough to meet Ethan's gaze, and for a moment, something in the air shifted. Not louder, not heavier, just different. "A long time ago," he said quietly. No pride. No explanation. Just a fact, placed gently between them. Ethan nodded, half interested, half amused. Figures. What was it back then? Radios and maps. Another small chuckle from the airman beside him. The old man didn't respond. His gaze drifted past them, back toward the window, where the horizon stretched thin and endless. Up front, a second voice crackled over a secured channel, unheard by the cabin, tight with urgency. "Command, we have unidentified alignment approaching commercial flight path. 2 fast movers, bearing 090. In the cockpit, instruments flickered with new data, green lines shifting across black screens. Outside, far beyond what most eyes could see, 2 shapes cut clean lines through the sky, closing distance with purpose. Back in seat 16A, the old man's fingers settled again, still as before, as if nothing had changed. But something had, and somewhere above them, the sky had already begun to take notice. The hum of the engines remained steady, but something beneath it had changed, subtle and almost imperceptible, like a second rhythm threading through the first. Lieutenant Ryan Brooks shifted in his seat, his eyes no longer on the tablet resting in his lap, but fixed quietly on the man in seat 16A. The tapping he had seen moments ago lingered in his mind, not as a random motion, but as something structured, intentional, like a signal that had been practiced thousands of times until it became instinct. Brooks leaned back slowly, his posture casual to anyone watching, but his attention sharpened to a fine edge. Across the aisle, Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole stretched his legs slightly, glancing again at the old man with the same mild curiosity that bordered on dismissal. "So what did you do?" Ethan asked, his tone lighter now, almost conversational, as if he had decided to entertain himself for the remainder of the flight. "Back then, I mean." The old man did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed outside the window, where the sky had begun to deepen in color as the sun angled lower, casting long streaks of gold across the wing. For a moment, it seemed like he might not respond at all. Then, without turning, he spoke. I listened. The answer was simple, almost too simple, and it drew a quiet snort from one of the airmen. "Listened," the airman repeated under his breath, amused. Ethan gave a small shake of his head, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Well, that sounds important," he said, the sarcasm light but unmistakable. The old man said nothing more. His hand rested again on his lap, still and relaxed, as if the conversation had already ended for him. Up front, the tension was no longer subtle. The cockpit displays showed two fast-moving signatures closing in, their speed and precision unmistakable. The pilot adjusted his headset, his voice controlled but tighter now. "Confirm identification," he said, eyes scanning the instruments. A response came back immediately, crisp and professional, but carrying an undercurrent of something else. Two F-35 aircraft, training route deviation authorized. Maintain current heading. The pilot frowned slightly. Training routes did not intersect like this. Not without reason. Back in the cabin, Brooks felt it before he fully understood it. A shift in the air, not physical, but perceptual. He had spent enough time around pilots, around command structures, to recognize when something larger was unfolding just beyond the visible layer of events. His eyes returned to the old man, narrowing slightly as memory began to surface, fragmented and incomplete. A briefing room, a dim screen, a list of call signs that were not supposed to be used casually, names that carried weight without explanation. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from recognition trying to break through. Outside, far off the right side of the aircraft, a glint of movement caught the attention of a passenger near the window. "Hey," someone whispered, leaning closer to the glass. "Is that?" The shape was distant at first, just a shimmer against the sky, but it grew clearer with each passing second, sleek lines cutting through the air with effortless precision. Another shape followed, perfectly aligned, moving in silent coordination. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's voice dropped an octave. "Visual confirmed," he said quietly. "They are holding formation." In seat 16A, the old man's eyes shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the change outside. No surprise, no curiosity, just awareness. His fingers moved once more, a faint, almost invisible motion against his knee, a rhythm that did not belong to the cabin, but to something far older, far more disciplined. Brooks saw it again, and this time, something clicked. Not fully, not yet, but enough to send a cold clarity through his thoughts. He reached slowly for his tablet, not to read, but to access a secured channel, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he understood that whatever he was about to confirm could not be undone. Across the aisle, Ethan leaned slightly toward the window, squinting at the distant aircraft. "No way," he murmured, the earlier amusement gone, replaced by something closer to confusion. "What are they doing this close?" No one answered him, because no one in that cabin, except one man, already knew. The tablet in Lieutenant Ryan Brooks's hands came alive with a soft glow as he accessed a secured channel, his fingers moving with practiced precision, each tap deliberate, each pause calculated. The cabin noise faded into the background for him, replaced by the quiet hum of protocol and memory aligning at once. He entered a single phrase into the system, not a full name, not a unit, just two words that had no business appearing in any casual record. Raven 6. The screen hesitated for less than a second before the response appeared, not in text, but in clearance prompts, layers of restrictions stacking instantly, as if the system itself was bracing. Brooks inhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as recognition settled fully into place. This was not a coincidence. This was not a story. This was something that had been buried on purpose. Across the aisle, Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole leaned closer to the window, his earlier confidence now replaced with a quiet unease he could not quite explain. The two distant aircraft were no longer just shapes. They were unmistakable now, sharp angles catching the sun, moving with a precision that felt intentional, controlled, almost ceremonial. "They are pacing us," Ethan said, his voice lower now, more to himself than anyone else. One of the airmen beside him shifted uncomfortably. "That is not normal, right?" Ethan did not answer, because he already knew it was not. In the cockpit, the pilot adjusted his grip on the controls, his eyes flicking between the horizon and the instruments. "Command, confirm intent of escort," he said, his voice steady but edged with something new. The reply came back slower this time, as if routed through channels that did not usually intersect with civilian flights. "Maintain current course. Do not deviate. Stand by for further instruction." The words were calm, but the pause before them had been too long. Back in seat 16A, Thomas Whitaker opened his eyes fully now, the pale blue sharp and clear, reflecting the light from the window. He did not look at the aircraft. He did not look at the people around him. He simply breathed, slow and even, as if the world outside the cabin was following a rhythm he had known long before anyone else noticed it. His right hand lifted slightly again, fingers pressing once against his knee, then twice, then stillness. A pattern, not random, never random. Brooks saw it clearly now, not just the motion, but the intent behind it. A signal that did not need to be heard to be understood. His throat felt dry as he glanced from the tablet to the man, then back again, as if confirming reality in two places at once. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir," he said, careful, respectful, the tone completely different from before. "When you said you listened, what exactly did you mean?" The old man turned his head slowly, meeting Brooks's gaze, and for a moment, the noise of the cabin seemed to fall away entirely. "I listen for things most people never hear," he said quietly. "No emphasis, no explanation, just truth, delivered without weight." Brooks nodded once, almost unconsciously, as if something inside him had already accepted the answer before his mind could question it. Across the aisle, Ethan shifted again, sensing the change but not understanding it, caught between curiosity and something that felt uncomfortably close to respect. Outside, the two aircraft adjusted their position slightly, tightening their formation, their movements smooth and precise, as if guided by something more than standard procedure. Inside the cockpit, a new voice entered the channel, deeper, older, carrying authority that did not need to be stated. "Commercial flight, this is command authority. Confirm passenger manifest for one Thomas Whitaker." The pilot blinked once, surprised by the directness of the request, then reached for the manifest, his fingers moving quickly now. Back in seat 16A, the old man's gaze returned to the horizon, where the sky stretched endless and quiet, as if nothing at all was happening. But everything was already in motion. The cockpit fell into a silence that did not belong to routine flight operations, the kind of silence that follows a command no one expected to hear. The pilot's eyes scanned the passenger manifest, his finger tracing down the list until it stopped, hovering for a fraction of a second before pressing lightly against the screen. "Thomas Whitaker," he read aloud, his voice controlled but carrying a weight that had not been there before. The co-pilot turned slightly, exchanging a brief glance that said more than words could. Names did not usually trigger this kind of attention, not from command authority, not at 30,000 feet over open sky. "Command, confirm," the pilot said, his tone tightening just enough to reveal the shift beneath his training. The response came back immediately this time. No delay, no hesitation, the voice firm and absolute. "Confirm identity. Maintain course. Do not alter altitude. All airspace in your sector is now under restricted observation." The words settled into the cockpit like a sealed order, final and unquestionable. Outside, the two fighter jets adjusted again, their formation tightening with precise intent, their distance now close enough that the shape of their wings and the faint shimmer of heat behind them became unmistakable to anyone looking closely. In the cabin, more passengers had begun to notice, their conversations fading into quiet murmurs, heads turning toward the windows, curiosity spreading like a slow ripple through the rows. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole leaned forward, his earlier confidence replaced by something sharper, more focused, his eyes narrowing as he watched the aircraft hold position alongside them. "They are not just passing through," he said under his breath, the realization settling in fully now. "They are staying with us." The airman beside him shifted, his voice lower, uncertain. Why would they escort a commercial flight? Ethan did not answer, because the question no longer felt rhetorical. It felt real. Across the aisle, Lieutenant Ryan Brooks lowered his tablet slightly, the secured screen still active, its layers of clearance quietly confirming what he already understood. He looked at the old man again, not with curiosity now, but with a measured, deliberate respect that had replaced every assumption he had made just minutes earlier. The pieces had aligned, not through explanation, but through absence, through the things that were not said, the records that were not accessible, the reactions that did not happen for ordinary names. Brooks leaned forward slightly, his voice careful, controlled. "Sir," he said, the word now carrying its full weight. "They are here for you, aren't they?" The question hung in the air between them, quiet but undeniable. Thomas Whitaker did not answer immediately. His gaze remained on the horizon, where the light had softened into a muted gold, the edge of the wing cutting cleanly through it. For a moment, it seemed like he might ignore the question entirely. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady, as if stating something that had already been decided long ago. "They are not here for me," he said. A brief pause followed, just long enough to shift the meaning. "They are here because of something I used to be." Brooks felt that settle deeper than any explanation could have, the distinction clear and absolute. Not ego, not pride, just fact. Across the aisle, Ethan turned slightly, catching the tone if not the meaning, his expression tightening as he looked between the two men, sensing the change without fully understanding it. Outside, the fighter jets moved again, not closer, not farther, but perfectly aligned, their presence no longer just visible, but deliberate, intentional, as if every inch of their position had been calculated with care. In the cockpit, a new instruction came through, quieter but more precise than anything before. "Prepare for acknowledgment protocol." The pilot's grip tightened slightly on the controls, his training holding steady even as the situation stepped beyond anything routine. Back in seat 16A, Thomas Whitaker's hand rested calmly against his knee, the faintest movement of his fingers returning for just a moment, a rhythm that belonged to another time, another sky, another kind of mission. Around him, the cabin watched, uncertain, curious, slowly realizing that whatever was happening outside was not random, not coincidence, but something deliberate, something rare. And at the center of it, the old man remained exactly as he had been since the beginning, quiet, still, and completely unmoved. The instructions settled into the cockpit with a gravity that could not be mistaken. Acknowledgement protocol was not a phrase used lightly, not at this altitude, not for a routine civilian flight. The pilot straightened slightly in his seat, his voice measured as he responded. "Command, confirm acknowledgement parameters." There was a brief pause, just long enough to signal that what followed was being handled at a level far beyond standard operations. When the reply came, it carried the unmistakable tone of senior authority, calm, precise, and final. "Maintain heading. Maintain speed. Escort will execute visual acknowledgement. No deviation required from your aircraft." The pilot exhaled slowly, his grip easing just enough to keep his movement steady. Outside, the two fighters shifted again, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with a smooth, deliberate precision that felt almost choreographed. They moved slightly ahead of the commercial jet, then angled back, aligning perfectly with the wings, their distance now close enough that every line of their structure was visible, every adjustment intentional. In the cabin, the murmurs had grown into a low, constant hum. Passengers leaning toward windows, pointing subtly, trying to understand what they were witnessing. A woman near the front whispered, "Are they escorting us?" The question carried down the aisle, unanswered but heavy with implication. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole no longer leaned back in his seat. He sat forward now, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the aircraft outside, his earlier certainty replaced entirely by something deeper, something closer to awe than confusion. "This is not a drill," he said quietly, the words meant only for himself, but they carried enough weight that the airman beside him went silent. Across the aisle, Lieutenant Ryan Brooks did not move. His tablet remained in his hand, but his attention was no longer on the screen. It was on the man beside the window, the quiet center of everything unfolding around them. Brooks had seen high-level responses before, had been part of coordinated operations that required precision and authority, but this felt different. This was not about strategy or logistics. This was about recognition. He turned slightly, his voice low, steady, respectful. "Sir, acknowledgment protocol is reserved for individuals of extraordinary significance." The statement was not a question, but it carried one beneath it. Thomas Whitaker did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the light now softened into a deeper amber, the sky stretching wide and uninterrupted. "They have their orders," he said simply. No elaboration, no denial, just a quiet acceptance of what was happening. Outside, the fighters moved again, this time with a clarity that removed all doubt about their intent. They rose slightly above the level of the commercial aircraft, then tilted just enough for their wings to catch the sunlight, a controlled, deliberate motion that could not be mistaken for anything but a signal. In the cockpit, the pilot watched closely, his breath steady as he observed the formation. "They are executing," he said quietly, almost to himself. The co-pilot nodded once, eyes fixed on the display. "That is a salute," he said, the realization landing with quiet certainty. In the cabin, a few passengers gasped softly, the movement outside now unmistakable even to those with no military background. The two jets held their position for a moment, perfectly aligned, perfectly still in relation to the larger aircraft, as if the sky itself had paused to acknowledge something unseen. Ethan felt it then, not as a thought, but as a shift in understanding, the pieces falling into place not through explanation, but through presence. He glanced at the old man, really looked at him for the first time, not as a passenger, not as a stranger, but as something else entirely, something he had not recognized before. "Who are you?" he started to say, but the words never fully formed. Because the answer was already in front of him, written not in rank or uniform, but in the reaction of everything around them. And in seat 16A, Thomas Whitaker remained still, his hands resting calmly, his expression unchanged, as if none of this was unexpected, as if this moment had been waiting for him long before the plane ever left the ground. The moment held longer than anyone expected, the two fighters suspended in perfect alignment just beyond the wing, their presence no longer a curiosity but a statement, something deliberate and unmistakable. In the cockpit, the pilot kept his eyes forward, but his awareness stretched outward, tracking every subtle movement of the aircraft beside them. "Command, acknowledgment complete," he said, his voice steady, though the significance of what he had just witnessed lingered beneath the surface. The response came back softer this time, almost measured with restraint. "Copy that. Maintain current flight path. Escort will disengage at designated boundary." There was no further explanation, none needed. Outside, the jets held their position for one final moment, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light, before beginning a gradual, synchronized climb. It was not abrupt, not dramatic, just a smooth and controlled ascent, like a quiet departure from a conversation that had already said everything it needed to. In the cabin, the silence deepened as more passengers understood what they had just seen, not in technical terms, but in feeling. Something rare had happened, something intentional. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole leaned back slowly in his seat, the energy that had once filled his posture now replaced by a stillness he did not recognize in himself. His eyes drifted from the window to the man beside it, and for the first time, there was no trace of amusement, no hint of dismissal. Only respect, unspoken but absolute. "I did not know," he said quietly, the words barely audible, not directed at anyone in particular, but carried by the weight of realization. Across the aisle, Lieutenant Ryan Brooks lowered his tablet completely, the screen dimming as if its purpose had been fulfilled. He studied Thomas Whitaker with a calm, deliberate focus, not searching for answers anymore, but acknowledging what had already been revealed. "They do not do that," Brooks said under his breath, more to himself than to the man beside him. "Not for anyone ordinary." The statement hung in the air, quiet but certain. Thomas Whitaker did not respond. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the last stretch of sunlight painted the sky in muted tones of gold and blue. His reflection rested faintly in the window, unchanged, steady, as if nothing had happened at all. His right hand shifted slightly once more, fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of his jacket, a small, almost imperceptible motion that carried the weight of habit rather than intention. Outside, the two jets continued their ascent, their distance increasing slowly, their forms becoming smaller against the vastness of the sky until they were no longer distinct shapes, just movement fading into the distance. The escort was over, but the meaning remained. In the cockpit, the pilot adjusted his course slightly as instructed, his movements returning to routine, but his mind did not. He glanced once at the manifest again, at the name that had triggered everything, and then back to the sky ahead. No further questions were asked. None were needed. Back in the cabin, the low murmur began to return, but it was different now, softer, more restrained, as if everyone instinctively understood that what had just occurred was not something to be disturbed by noise. Ethan shifted in his seat, his hands resting on his knees, his posture no longer rigid with certainty, but grounded, reflective. He glanced once more at the old man, then away, as if recognizing that some things were not meant to be pressed, not meant to be explained. "Sir," he said after a moment, his voice respectful, careful, "I appreciate your service." The words were simple, familiar, but this time they carried genuine weight. Thomas Whitaker turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the voice, his expression calm, unchanged. "It was a long time ago," he said quietly. "No pride, no dismissal, just distance." Ethan nodded once, understanding more in that moment than he could have explained minutes earlier. Across the aisle, Brooks allowed himself a small exhale, the tension leaving his shoulders as the situation settled into memory, already becoming something that would be carried forward, not as a story to tell, but as a moment to remember. And in seat 16A, Thomas Whitaker returned to stillness, the quiet center of a world that had just revealed itself, then moved on, leaving behind only the echo of recognition in those who had witnessed it. The cabin slowly returned to its natural rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm that had existed before. Conversations resumed in quieter tones, movements became more deliberate, and even the ambient hum of the aircraft seemed to settle into something more subdued, as if the space itself had absorbed what had just taken place. A flight attendant paused briefly near row 16, her professional composure intact, but her eyes lingering for just a moment longer than necessary on the man by the window before she continued down the aisle. She did not ask questions. She did not need to. Across the aisle, Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole sat with his hands loosely clasped, his gaze drifting occasionally toward the window, then back to the seat beside him, as if trying to reconcile the image of the quiet old man with the reality that had unfolded just minutes ago. The certainty he had carried earlier, the easy confidence in his understanding of the world, had shifted into something more grounded, more reflective. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Sir," he said again, more carefully this time, "those pilots, they knew who you were." It was not a challenge. It was an observation. Thomas Whitaker remained still for a moment, his eyes tracing the horizon where the last of the light softened into dusk. "They knew the call sign," he replied quietly. The distinction was subtle, but it carried weight. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that difference, understanding that recognition did not always come from a face or a name, but from something carried through time, through systems, through memory. A few rows ahead, Lieutenant Ryan Brooks rested his forearms lightly on his knees, his posture relaxed but his mind still active, replaying the sequence of events with the clarity of someone trained to analyze patterns. He had seen authority respond before, but never like this, never with such immediacy, such precision, such restraint. No announcement, no explanation, just action. He glanced once more at the man in seat 16A, then away, as if acknowledging that whatever had been confirmed did not belong to him to question further. "Some things stay classified for a reason," he murmured under his breath, the words carrying more understanding than curiosity. Outside, the sky had deepened into a rich, endless blue, the horizon now a thin line of fading light. The aircraft moved steadily forward, its path unchanged, its purpose simple, carrying passengers from one place to another. But for those who had witnessed the moment, the journey had taken on a different meaning. It was no longer just a flight. It was a reminder. In seat 16A, Thomas Whitaker adjusted his jacket slightly, a small movement that revealed nothing new, nothing obvious, just the quiet presence of a man who had long since stepped away from whatever had once defined him. His hands settled again, calm, steady, as if they had never moved at all. A young passenger across the aisle, no older than 20, leaned toward his companion, whispering softly, "Who do you think he is?" The question lingered, unanswered, drifting through the space like a thought no one wanted to disturb. Ethan heard it, but he did not respond. Not this time. Because he understood now that the answer was not something that could be given in a sentence, not something that could be reduced to rank or title. It was something that had to be recognized, not explained. The aircraft continued its course, the cabin lights dimming slightly as evening settled in, casting a softer glow across the rows. The world outside grew darker, quieter, stretching endlessly ahead. And in that quiet, the significance of what had happened did not fade. It deepened, not as a spectacle, not as a story to impress, but as a moment of quiet truth. That some names, some call signs, did not belong to the present. They belonged to something larger, something carried forward not in words, but in the way the world responded when it heard them again. And at the center of it all, Thomas Whitaker remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, just a passenger in seat 16A, moving through the sky like anyone else, except for the silence that followed him, and the respect that had already been given without a single word asked in return. The cabin lights dimmed further as the aircraft crossed into the deeper stretch of evening, a soft amber glow settling over the rows, turning reflections into shadows and voices into quiet murmurs. The outside world had disappeared into a vast dark canvas, broken only by faint starlight and the steady blink of the wingtip. What had happened earlier now felt distant, almost unreal, yet its presence lingered in the way people sat a little straighter, spoke a little softer, as if instinctively aware they had witnessed something not meant for noise. In the cockpit, the pilot completed a routine systems check, his hands steady, his voice returning to standard communication patterns, but his thoughts still anchored to the moment that had broken the routine. He glanced once more at the flight data, then at the manifest, the name still there, unchanged, ordinary in appearance, yet tied to something far beyond the screen. "Command confirms normal operations," the co-pilot said quietly, as if closing a chapter that had never been officially opened. The pilot nodded, but neither of them spoke further about it. Some acknowledgments did not require discussion. Back in the cabin, Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole leaned back fully into his seat for the first time since the encounter, his posture no longer tense, but settled, grounded in a way he had not expected. His eyes closed briefly, not in sleep, but in thought, replaying every word, every detail, every assumption he had made that no longer held weight. When he opened them again, his gaze drifted once more to the man beside the window. There was no longer a question forming in his mind, no urge to understand beyond what had already been shown. Respect had replaced curiosity, and with it came restraint. "You ever think about it?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice careful not to disturb the stillness. All of it, back then. The question was not probing. It was human. Thomas Whitaker remained still, his reflection faint against the glass, the darkness outside offering no distraction, only depth. "Sometimes," he said after a moment. His voice carried no weight of regret, no pride, just distance, as if the memories belonged to another life, one that had already been lived and set down. Ethan nodded once, accepting the answer without needing more. A few rows ahead, Lieutenant Ryan Brooks rested his head lightly against the seat, his eyes open but unfocused, his thoughts moving through layers of training and experience, now intersecting with something personal, something grounding. He had spent years studying systems, ranks, procedures, believing that structure defined importance. But what he had just witnessed had not followed structure. It had bypassed it, gone straight to recognition. He exhaled slowly, a small shift, but meaningful. "There is always something deeper," he murmured quietly, not to anyone, but to the realization itself. The aircraft continued forward, cutting through the night with steady precision, its path unchanged, its purpose simple. Yet inside, something had shifted in ways that could not be measured by instruments or recorded in logs. It lived in the silence, in the restraint, in the quiet understanding that not everything needed to be known to be respected. A flight attendant passed once more through the aisle, her steps soft, her presence unobtrusive. As she neared seat 16A, she slowed just slightly, offering a small, professional nod, nothing more, nothing less. Thomas Whitaker acknowledged it with the faintest tilt of his head, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, yet complete in its meaning. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, dark and calm, the earlier movement now gone, leaving no trace except memory. And in that quiet expanse, the aircraft carried on, just another flight among thousands, except for those who knew that for a brief moment, the sky itself had responded, not with noise or display, but with something far rarer. Recognition without announcement, respect without demand. And at the center of it all, the old man remained exactly as he had been, still, quiet, and entirely at peace with a world that had already said everything it needed to say. The aircraft began its gradual descent, the subtle shift in engine tone barely noticeable to most, but enough to signal the final phase of the journey. Cabin lights adjusted softly, brightening just enough to bring the interior back into focus, returning the space to something familiar, something ordinary. Outside, the darkness gave way to scattered lights far below, small clusters forming patterns of towns and highways, a quiet reminder that the world continued as it always had. Inside, the silence that had settled earlier did not disappear, it simply transformed, becoming part of the atmosphere, something carried forward without being spoken. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole sat upright as the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and routine, announcing their descent and expected arrival time. The words were standard, practiced, but Ethan heard them differently now, grounded by everything that had happened between takeoff and this moment. He glanced once more toward seat 16A, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to acknowledgment, a quiet recognition that did not need to be expressed again. Lieutenant Ryan Brooks closed his tablet fully, placing it carefully into his bag, as if sealing away the confirmation he had found earlier. His posture was relaxed, but his expression carried a thoughtful stillness, the kind that comes from understanding something that cannot be easily explained. He looked once toward the old man, then forward again, accepting that some truths were not meant to be pursued beyond the moment they revealed themselves. Attention, it did not feel ordinary. It felt complete.